Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 444. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to talk about on today's show, so be sure to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. And of course, if you follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_, you can always retweet the show and any questions you have or anything else, you always ask them on Twitter. So everybody, thank you so much for tuning in, and let's get into today's news. The first story today I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on July 9th. Turkey bats NATO membership for Ukraine, but not Sweden. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has come out in favor of Ukraine joining the North Atlantic Alliance, but remains firmly opposed to Sweden joining the bloc. The policy puts Ankara at odds with Washington, who supports Stockholm joining the alliance, but not Kiev. Erdogan met with Ukrainian President Zelensky in Istanbul on Friday. The Turkish leader said Ukraine deserves NATO membership with no doubt. President Joe Biden disagrees with Erdogan regarding Kiev's NATO bid. In an interview that aired last week on CNN, he said, "I don't think there is anonymity in NATO about whether or not to bring Ukraine into the NATO family now at this moment in the middle of a war," he said, adding, "If the war is going on, then we're all in a war. We're at war with Russia if that were the case." Throughout the conflict, Ankara has served as a diplomatic bridge between NATO and Moscow. A Turkish-led diplomatic effort nearly ended the war in the first 3 months, and Turkey brokered the grain export agreement that is responsible for helping to alleviate food shortages created by the war. Turkey has additionally opposed NATO expansion into Sweden and Finland. Last year, Ankara inked a trilateral pact with Stockholm and Helsinki. Turkey said Finland met its commitments in the agreement and lifted its block on Helsinki's NATO membership bid. However, Ankara claims Stockholm is refusing to fully implement the agreement. The spat between the two nations has been exacerbated by Sweden allowing Quran burnings, and some of these Quran burnings have happened in protests to Turkey. I think one was even right outside the Turkish consulate in Stockholm. So Turkey's diplomatic outreach to Moscow, opposition to NATO expansion in Finland, and its refusal to sanction Russia has been used to criticize Erdogan for not being sufficiently anti-Kremlin. As for Kiev's desire to join NATO is a key reason Moscow went to war, it is unclear if Ankara's support for Ukraine becoming a member of the bloc will damage Erdogan's relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Next month in Turkey, Erdogan says he will meet with his Russian counterpart. The Turkish leader believes the grain export deal will be extended. Our hope is that it will be extended at least once every 3 months, not every 2 months. We will make an effort in this regard and try to increase the duration of it to 2 years, he said. Erdogan added he would make a phone call to Putin concerning a potential prisoner swap. And so, I think this is an important story for a number of reasons, and I think the last thing I kind of bring up in my article here may be the most significant, and that is Turkey has, really been the country, maybe other than the United Nations, and at a time there was Israel, that has been able to talk with both sides here. Any Chinese-led mediation efforts, the proposals put forward by Africa, Brazil, and Mexico have all been more or less kind of ignored because those countries either lack, I guess, the geopolitical status to make that happen, like in the case of Mexico or the African coalition, and then the other countries, China and then the Brazilian president, have just been dismissed and denounced as not being anti-Russia enough to lead the mediation effort. And so that's why what Turkey has done here has been so important and so crucial. And I think it would be a really bad thing, of course, if Turkey would lose that stance, that position that they hold there. Now, of course, Turkey could hold whatever position they want. I'm not saying that Turkey should be opposed to Ukraine joining NATO. That's not my call. At the same time, you would think that Turkey would recognize a lot of the problems that we tend to talk about on this show. And like what Biden's talking about, if Ukraine joins NATO now, they'll be at direct odds. NATO will be through Ukraine will be at direct odds with Russia, and those two blots will be at war, which is a terrifying thing to think about. So, I guess another note here, and just on that, I wonder if there are some politics at play, maybe from Erdogan's position. He sees and understands that it really is Turkey that is blocking Sweden from joining NATO. Otherwise, I think it would go through. I don't think Hungary would maintain its opposition if Turkey wasn't also imposed and taking all the heat for opposing, because those are the only two countries that haven't signed whatever or taken whatever internal steps needed to allow Sweden to join NATO, and Sweden has applied to join. So that I do think that's going to happen. So I maybe wonder if Erdogan sees the situation here where he knows that because of the American, because of the German, because of the French opposition, Ukraine's not joining NATO anytime soon. And so and I think Erdogan's a very wily leader, very dangerous, very smart. And so maybe he sees this and he says, okay, well, I'm constantly blasted as being too pro Putin, even though, there's not a lot of evidence for that. So if I say I want Ukraine to join NATO, something I know that's not going to happen anyways, I could use that as a, shield whenever somebody accuses me of being pro-Kremlin. I'll say, well, look, I hold the most anti-Kremlin position of all of you guys, something that a lot of countries are unwilling to do, we support here. So maybe that has something to do with it. We'll see how this impacts the grain export deal, if at all. I know Russia is very unhappy with the way that's being implemented and has threatened to shut it off. But Erdogan saying that he expects, this deal to be continued, and actually in a longer time, not 2 months, but 3 months, would be huge. So possibly some good news on that. If he is able to negotiate a prisoner swap, that's good news too. But for now, I'm kind of concerned about this, and it could ruin Turkey's position as a country that mediates. Now, 1 second here. All right, the next article is by Dave DeCamp, and we're going to get a little bit more into what the American position is when it comes to allowing Ukraine into NATO. So Dave writes, President Biden said Friday that Ukraine won't be brought into NATO anytime soon, but said he was willing to give Kiev support similar to what the U.S. provides Israel. I don't think there is any unanimity in NATO about whether or not to bring Ukraine into the NATO family at this moment in the middle of a war, he told CNN's Fareed Zakaria. He acknowledged that bringing Ukraine into NATO would mean if there is a war going on, then we're all in war. NATO is holding a summit in Vilnius starting this Tuesday, so starting tomorrow as of the recording of this show, and the alliance is expected to give new commitments to Ukraine. Kiev is seeking a promise that it can join NATO once the war is over, but the U.S. has expressed reluctance to give that pledge. Biden said that there are other outstanding issues besides the war that need to be considered before offering Ukraine membership, but I think it's premature to call for a vote, in now, because there are other qualifications that need to be met, including democratization of some of those issues. And so this is interesting because all the time we hear from the mainstream media, from the Biden administration, that what we need to do in Ukraine while we're fighting this war in Ukraine is to defend Ukraine's democracy. And here's Biden admitting that there are some issues with that democracy. Now, that's not going as far as to what myself and a lot of other people will point out, and that is Ukraine probably really isn't a democracy anymore. And Zelensky has more or less made himself the dictator of the country. There's no elections. He's canceled the main opposition party, got rid of those, arrested a lot of the significant opposing members of the opposite party, nationalized the media, including the online media and the blogs. And so there's complete narrative control in Ukraine by Kiev, and complete political control as well. So that makes Zelensky a dictator. Now, I think that there's actually a different motive here from the West and why they don't want to make this promise to Ukraine. And that's because I think it gives Ukraine incentive to negotiate a settlement and end this war. I think there has to be a reality understood in Ukraine. Maybe they don't accept this as the reality, but they have to see the potential for what's going to happen here is eventually they will start to lose the war of attrition with Russia, and Russia will take more and more Ukrainian territory slowly over time. And so I would have to imagine that there are people within Zelensky's circle that are telling him that the sooner you negotiate, the less territory or the more territory Ukraine will have at the end of this war, right? That I'm sure there are people in Zelensky's circle who are, and maybe this is the majority voice, saying that, look, if we only fight longer, if we only fight harder, if we only get more weapons from the West, we'll be able to take back the Crimean Peninsula. But there has to be people around him too who, in private conversation, at least whenever the cameras are turned off, the doors are shut, that they acknowledge that the reality may be not so rosy and there may be a reason to negotiate sooner rather than later. And I have to imagine that if NATO would make the pledge that Ukraine would become a NATO member after the war was over, that would really incentivize Kiev to sit down with Russia. Now, there's another, kind of step to that, and then Russia doesn't want that. And so would Russia, seeing that Ukraine has that promise of NATO membership, then have to act as if Ukraine became a NATO member, and any settlement to the war, Kiev would have to be left in such a rump state form that it's not a threat to Russia, even if it is a member of NATO. I that's a possibility of that, reality too, to look at. But definitely interesting that they really don't want to make that pledge. So Biden also mentioned how he refused to give Russian President Putin a guarantee that Ukraine won't ever join before Russia invaded Ukraine. He said, the very first time I met with Putin 2 years ago in Geneva, he said, I want commitments, no Ukraine in NATO. I said, we're not going to do that because there is an open door policy. An alternative for Ukraine that has been considered by NATO members is an, quote, Israel model, something President Biden discussed for the first time with Zakaria. However, Biden suggested that the support could only be provided once there is a ceasefire. And one of the things I indicated is that the United States would be ready to provide while the process was going on, and it's going to take a while to provide security a la the security we provide for Israel, providing the weaponry they need, the capacity to defend themselves if there is an agreement, if there is a ceasefire, if there is a peace agreement, he said. So that's kind of interesting. I imagine that they're going to get a commitment. Ukraine is going to get a commitment during the Vilnius summit for a lot of weapons, and it's going to go beyond the cluster bombs. But let's talk about cluster bombs for a minute, because I think this is really important. Congressional Democrats, U.S. allies break with Biden on cluster bombs for Ukraine. President Biden's decision to arm Ukraine with cluster bombs has sparked rare Democratic criticism of his proxy war with Russia, and some of the U.S.'s top NATO allies have also spoken out against the move. This is Representative Betty McCollum, a Democrat from Minnesota. There is a decision in the Biden administration to transfer cluster munitions to Ukraine is unnecessary and a terrible mistake. The legacy of cluster bombs is misery, death, and expensive cleanup generations after their use. These weapons should be eliminated from our stockpiles, not dumped in Ukraine. 19 House progressives issued a joint statement condemning the move, and this is what the statement said. Cluster munitions have been banned by nearly 125 countries under the United Nations Convention on Cluster Munitions because of the indiscriminate harm they cause, including mass civilian injuries and death. Representative Barbara Lee, a Democrat from California, signed on to the statement and criticized Biden's decision in an appearance on CNN. She said cluster bombs should never be used. That's crossing a line. NATO allies Spain, the UK, and Canada, all parties to the Convention on Cluster Munitions, have warned against providing Ukraine with cluster munitions. Spain, based on the firm commitment it has with Ukraine, also has firm commitment that certain weapons and bombs cannot be delivered under any circumstances, the Spanish defense minister said. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said the UK will uphold its commitment as a signatory to the convention, which prohibits the production or use of cluster munitions and discourages their use. The Canadian government said in a statement that we do not support the use of cluster munitions and are committed to putting an end to their effect on cluster munitions on civilians, particularly children. And we've talked about cluster munitions quite a bit on this show because of their legacy, particularly in the Vietnam War, and going on to this day, continuing to kill civilians and things like that. We've been very opposed to sending cluster bombs to Ukraine. This will create a problem for either Ukraine or Russia, I guess, depending on who ends up with the territory, long after the war and cleanup efforts and things like that. So this is horrible. Now, the good news here is the Democrats, 19, that's not a lot, but that is a good number of Democrats, are not happy with this decision. And so I'm not saying this is going to be enough, that they are going to vote against the next massive aid package for Ukraine. However, I do think there was already growing momentum to have a put in the next bill, some kind of provision put in the next bill that creates an inspector general for the weapons going to Ukraine. And so maybe this is going to build some of that momentum with more Democrats being skeptical. I'm hopeful that this is, the crack in the Democratic caucus needed to raise some more skepticism about sending all these weapons. I could be wrong. I could be unnecessarily hopeful, and it really is just about the cluster bombs. And as long as they're sending F-16s, then the Democrats don't care. But I could see, a growing number of Democrats getting upset about this. And then look, what often happens is they go too hard. When I say they, I mean, I think the mainstream media will often go too hard criticizing. And so they'll say, oh, look at all these pro-Kremlin Democrats and things like that. And they, it may wake them up and have them become more skeptical of all aid. So this could be a good thing. I'm not saying it is for sure going to be something that ends up at least curbing the aid that the U.S. is sending Ukraine, but it could be one of those steps in the political process and the political dynamics of the U.S. that is really helpful. All right, so Biden defends the decision. President Biden on Friday defended his decision to arm Ukraine with cluster bombs, which are banned by over 100 nations because they are exceptionally harmful to civilians. The Pentagon announced on Friday that the U.S. will be sending cluster munitions to Ukraine as a part of an $800 million weapons package. Kiev will receive the dual-purpose improved conventional munitions, DPICM, and the small bomblets packed into the 155 millimeter artillery shells designed to spread the submunitions. On February 28th, 22, then White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, who now has her own TV show on MSNBC, told reporters that Russia's use of cluster munitions in Ukraine would potentially be a war crime. But now the Biden administration has changed its tune on the widely banned munitions. Speaking to CNN's Fareed Zakaria on Friday, President Biden said he needed to send cluster munitions to Ukraine because the U.S. and Ukraine are running out of ammunition. This is a war relating to munitions, and they are running out of that ammunition, and we're low on it. So what I finally did, I took the recommendation of the Defense Department to not permanently, but allow for this transition period where we get more 105 millimeter weapons, these shells, for the Ukrainians. While Biden frames the provision of cluster bombs as temporary, Colin Powell, the Undersecretary for Defense Policy, said the U.S. will arm Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of the munitions. Cluster bombs are especially hazardous to civilians because many of the bomblets don't explode on impact, meaning that people could find them years later. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. dropped millions of cluster bomblets on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and each country is still dealing with them to this day. Cal insisted that the cluster munitions the U.S. will send to Ukraine were tested and will have a dud rate of 2.35%. The New York Times report that rate will likely be closer to 14% due to factors on the battlefield that were not taken into account during the Pentagon's test. The Times report said that each 105 millimeter artillery shell will be packed with 72 bomblets, a dud rate of 14%, and each shell could leave behind about 10 unexploded bomblets, a major hazard for civilians if they're not cleaned up. And think about it. If we're going to send hundreds of thousands of them, then say we send 200,000 and there's 10 unexploded bomblets each, that would be 2 million unexploded bomblets littered across Ukraine when this whole thing is over. And that number could be a lot higher. My understanding is the U.S. has over 1 million, maybe 1.2 million of these cluster bombs. And so if we sent them all, that would be tens of millions of little bomblets laying around. Cal said that the U.S. has received assurances that Ukraine won't use cluster munitions in civilian-populated urban environments. But cluster munitions are incredibly hazardous to people living in rural areas, as they are often found by farmers or children playing in forest. Ukraine has a history of using cluster bombs against civilian-populated areas. In 2014, Human Rights Watch reported that the Kiev government was using cluster munitions in populated areas of Donetsk city. Ukraine has also used cluster bombs in populated areas during the current conflict with Russia. A day before the Pentagon announced it was arming Ukraine with cluster bombs, Human Rights Watch issued a report saying that Ukrainian forces killed at least 8 civilians with cluster bombs in an eastern Ukrainian city. And so we also know that Ukraine is using the scatter mines, the butterfly mines, and they are dropping those in city areas as well. And those are almost like the cluster bombs, except the bomblets intentionally don't explode and are littering the ground for a long period of time to come. All right, one more story on the cluster bombs. Cambodian Prime Minister urges Ukraine not to use U.S. cluster bombs. The Cambodian Prime Minister has used Ukraine not to employ U.S.-provided cluster bombs in its war against Russia, pointing to the legacy of U.S. cluster bombs used in his country as a warning. It would be the greatest danger for Ukrainians for many years, or up to 100 years, if cluster bombs are used in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine, he said. Cluster munitions spread small bomblets over large areas, and many don't explode on impact. I guess in the Vietnam War in surrounding countries, Laos and Cambodia, the U.S. dropped 26 million cluster bomblets, and about 25% of those didn't explode. And so if you think about it, I mean, if the New York Times numbers are accurate and it's like 14%, that's only half about that are going to explode and detonate now, more so than before. So the situation in Ukraine isn't going to be that much better than the situation in Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam, where we know this is plaguing civilian populations still, and we could be talking about, again, depending on how many cluster bombs the U.S. ends up sending Ukraine. I mean, we could be talking about numbers that are not out of line with what the U.S. used in the Vietnam War, and this could be a huge problem for Ukraine for years to come. All right. I think this is the last story we have today. Former U.S. official denies defends meeting with Russian foreign minister. So Richard Haass, a former diplomat and former president of the Council on Foreign Relations, has defended a meeting that he held with Russian foreign minister Sergei Lavrov that was first reported by NBC News last week. According to NBC, Haass and two other former U.S. officials and members of the Council on Foreign Relations met with Lavrov in April when he was in New York for a UN Security Council meeting. The report said that Lavrov and the former U.S. officials discussed potential diplomatic off-ramps and the fate of the Russian-controlled Ukrainian territory. The Russian Foreign Ministry confirmed the meeting took place on April 24th, but disputed the idea that the negotiations were secret or that they discussed a potential Ukraine peace plan. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said on Telegram that the talks were a part of regular discussions Russian officials have with political scientists and public figures with leading delegations to the UN. She said that the Council on Foreign Relations members who did not want the meeting to be made public, they are justifiably concerned about the highly toxic atmosphere in the American media and the reaction of the U.S. authorities. Haass and other officials who attend the meeting did come under criticism from Russia Haass in the U.S. for engaging with Lavrov, and the Biden administration distanced itself from the talks. In an article on his Substack, Haass said the unofficial meetings are important as there are little engagements between the U.S. and Russian governments. And he wrote, "Such meetings can be valuable opportunities to keep channels of communication open at moments when such official interactions are either non-existent or unproductive and the stakes are high. They permit participants to convey their views on a range of subjects while providing an opportunity to get a better idea of the thinking of those associated with other countries and governments." And yeah, this is true. It's awesome that, Richard Haass is writing this. Unfortunately, this should be the consensus in Washington. This should be how foreign policy is regularly discussed and talked about, that there has to be communication so all sides understand each other and know what the other side's position are. But the political climate in the U.S. doesn't allow for it. And it's, kind of funny that the Russian spokeswoman is able to identify this. And, it goes to how deep the problem really is, where it's almost impossible for U.S. and Russian officials to talk because there's so much political momentum against that you're going to be raked across the coals in the U.S. mainstream media if you engage Russia in any kind of positive way. All right, so Haass also did not characterize the meetings as negotiations. He said, critically, such meetings are conversations, not negotiations. Those involved speak for themselves, not for any institution they might be affiliated with, and certainly not for the U.S. government, although relevant government officials are kept informed about what is taking place. And so that's good, right? So, because Antony Blinken is a terrible diplomat, terrible Secretary of State, he can go to, I guess he could go to Lavrov and have a conversation, but he won't. But Haass and whoever these other officials are can maybe have a conversation with the Russian officials that is reasonable and not heated and incredibly antagonistic, and that actually he could then go to the American officials and say, oh, this is what the Russians are saying to us, and it's a way that we could build towards diplomacy and talk. So I think this is a good thing that this meeting happened. Initially, I was pretty cold on it because I I was under the impression that the Russians came out and denied the meeting happened, but that's not exactly right. The Russians were just denying that negotiations happened, not the meeting itself. So good news here, and hopefully this develops into something bigger. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We will be back with at least one more show this week. I'm a little unclear of what the schedule for the show is going to be later in the week, because me and Connor Freeman will be out at Freedom Fest in Memphis. So if anybody's at Freedom Fest, please stop by the Libertarian Institute antiwar.com area, and me and Connor will be happy to talk to you, of course. I think we'll have some books for sale and stuff. I haven't written a book, but Scott Horton's and Keith Snide's book. And yeah, so please come hang out with the Libertarian Institute guys at Freedom Fest. And again, at least one more show later this week. Thanks, everyone.